Hello, welcome to Art After Hours. My name's Yumi Stynes. Before we go any further, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the stolen land where the Art Gallery of New South Wales stands, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome if this is your first time to Art After Hours. This is basically a weekly talk series where you'll hear artists and thinkers and celebrities and just regular people in conversation as they explore themes and artworks from the exhibitions that are currently on display in the gallery. This week, we're celebrating NAIDOC Week 2020 with the theme Always Was, Always Will Be. And like last week, if you happen to be joining us then, we'll be taking questions again. If you're watching this on Facebook Live on Wednesday, the 11th of November, you can post your questions there. And if you're watching on YouTube, put them in the comments and we'll answer the good ones. Let me introduce our amazing guests tonight. I'm super excited to introduce you to Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts, who won the 2019 Young People's Human Rights Medal. She is a proud Bundjalung woman, activist and youth leader. At the age of 11, she was forcibly removed from the care of her father and placed in out-of-home care, and has used her personal experience as a driver for her motivation to study law and social work. Welcome. And Blak Douglas, who was born in 1970 to an Aboriginal father of the Dungari people and an Irish-Australian mother. Blak Douglas lives and works in Sydney. Originally trained in illustration and photography, he's a self-taught painter whose bold works focus on what it means to be an Aboriginal person in the 21st century. He's been exhibiting for more than 20 years and has been an Archibald finalist 4 times, including this year for his amazing portrait of Dujuan Hoosan. Welcome both of you, and thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to hear everything you've got to say. My ambition is to speak as little as possible. Tell us, I'll start with you, Blak Douglas. What do art and activism have in common?
Well, of course they go hand in hand, particularly when you wake up daily as a First Nations person. So I think most First Nations people waking up daily doing their own thing. You start your day with a mouthful of activism like you do your Cocoa Pops. So it just, for me, it just became commensurate and fluid with my practice of making art.
Vanessa, is it the same for you?
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Before I do yarn, I just also want to acknowledge traditional custodians of these lands and pay my respects to the stolen land that we are on. It is, was and always will be First Nations lands. Yeah, no, I agree with Blak. Like, being First Nations in this country, you don't really have an opportunity to kind of switch off that activism or switch off whether you choose to be silent or not, because it's every day you're waking up and you're actually waking up to the injustices and I guess the disproportionate impact of what we are subjected to. And I think, you know, one of the most beautiful things is when you capture artists like Blak and you see that display, it's another form of activism. You know, it's the creative writers, it's the producers, it's the directors, it's the athletes, and that's all activism. You know, being Black and surviving is activism, and your art is beautiful, and it's something that we need to honour in that activism.
Yeah.
And art coexisting together.
Just showing up is being an activist.
Absolutely.
And being an artist is about kind of creating disturbance.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you know, the greatest art is when you disrupt the streets, disrupt the artwork, create a space, create an energy.
Like, can you tell us about being a Westie?
Being a Westie?
Yeah.
It's a very proud and honourable thing. I was raised on Winnamata country, which is otherwise known as Penrith. And that's Yam country, and so amongst the Darug people out there, and that's where the foundations of the art began, in a little industrial unit in Jamison Town, and that was 1998, and here we are sitting in the Opera House of Art.
It's pretty massive, isn't it? Tell us about how 2020 has affected both of you. It's been really a very tumultuous year in so many ways, but in particular the way that Black Lives Matter was occurring over in the United States and then being kind of reinterpreted here in Australia. Has it been, has the political attention been a positive for you, Vanessa?
I think the political attention is actually like it's never really positive, because it's, again, we're out there and we're demanding justice for Black lives, Black bodies and Black lands, and it's something that's never going to have a positive element to it, because the reality is we're in a system that's designed and that is targeting First Nations people here in this space. And I think for 2020 it created a space of silence, but it also created a space of, well, who's speaking up and who's actually paying attention to the silence that's happening behind the wars. And I guess when I'm talking about those wars, I'm referring to the prison wars, I'm referring to the refugee wars, I'm referring to, when you're walking down the street, in your corporate space, in your community space, are you choosing to be silent in that space, or are you choosing to actually speak up in the moments of severe oppression, which, has been here since the first moments of invasion? And, for the Black Lives Matter movement, may George Floyd rest in peace, but that Black Lives Matter movement has been happening here in Australia since invasion. You just got to look at David Dungay. You just have to look at Arnie Sherrill. You just have to look at all these First Nations people that are dying at the hands of police and the policing system that we have in this space. And that'll just tell you that with Black Lives Matter heightening more in 2020, it's also been a moment to see who's being silent, which is disappointing and not a positive element to that space.
Sure.
But it's a moment where we can use art again to disrupt that space.
So when you talk about silence, you mean allies or the absence of allyship? Is that what you mean?
Absolutely.
So people who should be backing or shouting or protesting really just being bystanders?
Yeah, and it comes into that yarn, Black Lives Matter more than the week that it did go viral, more than the week that organisations and magazines decided to come out and say, yeah, we want to be a token, and we want you in this space right now, and we want to be demanding justice. Like, the reality is, for our aunties, for our uncles, for our Black women, our Black bodies that are literally being murdered and missing in this country, they're not being spoken about the 365. And I'm sorry, but our bodies matter 365 days a year, not just when it pleases the viral or gets the media attention. It's about genuine, accurate change, about holding, Department of Public Prosecutions accountable. It's about going down in your streets and, in your local coffee shop having those conversations, and it's about keeping it consistent. This is probably the most important thing.
Sure thing.
We're in 2020 and tokenism just isn't cool. let's get
Like, can I ask you about it? What was your reaction when you saw kind of the groundswell of support from mainstream Australia to Black Lives Matter? Was it a bit of an eye roller for you?
I took it on the chin, my sizable chin, and decided, like, pipe down. Just any advancement is a positive thing, and we need to get that wave happening to create any movement forward. As Vanessa said, at 2020, for God's sake, it's like, when are we going to grow up? When we're going to stop being a nation of teenagers and actually become adult enough to disband and prejudice that has existed for so long here, and seems to be upheld and maintained. And so, my knee-jerk reaction to losing Uncle George Floyd and then the consequent hashtag BLM movement here was to create a series of paintings, and I'm really proud that was my knee-jerk reaction, because interestingly, that suite of paintings has focused on the Black female, because when I go to many protests, and when I have gone to the protest, I would see Vanessa on the mic, I would see other Black women on the mic, and that was a massive positive change for me, to see for once the female getting the voice.
I did see you leading a protest, a couple of protests that I attended, Vanessa, and it was genuinely inspiring to see you up the front there. What's that feeling of responsibility like? It's
I wouldn't say I took the full lead of that space, because I definitely play a small role in being an organiser in that position. And the protest that I think you're referring to is the Kumajani Walker protest, a proud Warlpiri man who was murdered at the hands of police in the Northern Territory. In saying that, during NAIDOC week on Monday night, it was his 1 year since he was murdered, and I think that needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be amplified. Your question about that responsibility, I think I speak for a lot of Indigenous sisters and brothers we don't really have the choice to turn away from that responsibility. We don't really have the choice to be like, you know what, I'm switching off and I'm going to pay no attention, because, you know, we are 3.5% of the population, and, you know, I see my beautiful sister girls out there birthing beautiful babies, and these babies are going to grow up, and they're going to grow up with, you know, a system that's targeting these young black babies and these young black bodies. And, you know, for parents out there, that is a legitimate fear for children growing up. And so that responsibility is collective. And in the midst of that, you know, collective responsibility, there's also a lot of collective love. And, you know, I do acknowledge the non-Indigenous people that are showing up, but in the midst of what it means to be First Nations, it's not work for me. It's not a job. It's not this extra thing. It's just the way it is when you're First Nations in this country growing up, and it's a responsibility that I'm proud of, because, you know, our elders and our ancestors have been walking that path much harder than we have, and they've set that path for us to actually be able to continue that fight, and that's something to honour, and something to honour in NAIDOC as well.
I think I get it, like you don't get to take your skin off at the end of the day and hang it up in the closet and choose a different skin the next day. Blak, I wanted to ask you, speaking of sisters and love, there's a motif in particularly your big gallery works of the stripes in the background. We've seen it in this year's Archibald entry, and I think last year's as well, in a lot of those works. Can you help us to understand what's going on with that work?
Ever since I began painting, there was always a linear representation in the skies of the landscape paintings, and they began as many lines. It was always representative of song lines originally, and that was the idea, was that we might be in an urban centre, we might be sitting in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, you walk outside into the metropolis of Sydney, but spirituality is there, and if you're fortunate enough to spend time with remote region people, then you learn how to tap into spirituality, even though you've got an urban cityscape. So those song lines then morphed into what we now see as the 7 bands consistently in my skies and backgrounds in the portraits, and that's the acknowledgement of 7 sisters dreaming, but they're often skewed and they became fragmented from a perfect horizontal plane, and the fragmentation or the skewing of the bands in the skies now, that's acknowledging that the 5 states and 2 territories has fragmented 7 sisters dreaming. And so not only physically, if you put a fence up the other side of the west of this continent and call it Western Australia, then that's fragmented the traversing of the landscape for various mobs. But it's also, while we're under the Commonwealth banner, it's fragmenting the acknowledgement of the most dominant dreaming on the continent, which is 7 sisters dreaming.
Since we are in an art space, I do want to go further into the art discussion, if that's all right. What don't people understand about Aboriginal art?
Oh, that's a loaded one, isn't it? I mean, we're going to talk about...
Don't appropriate it, for one.
Yeah, Christian Thompson, we're going to talk about Richard Bell. Well, actually, fundamentally, what people don't understand is the diversity. And we're sitting here in an incredibly diverse exhibition. And Palawa works over there, you know, Murray works, and unfortunately, something we might touch on a bit later is that we need to break out of the stereotypes and the myths that constitute what Aboriginal art is. And thankfully, that's what the Urbana is doing right here. We've got a mixed bag of everything from across the continent. We have to steer away from stereotypes en masse, generally.
Yeah. Well, it's true. Like you mentioned diversity of art, but it's diversity of First Nations people, really, isn't it? And not assuming that everybody fits into one box or one category. I know you've got some opinions about this, Vanessa. Art spaces neglecting First Nations people. What's been your witness of that experience?
I just think, you know, when I think of all the incredible creatives that I know within the art space, they're not being provided to actually use their autonomy to speak in these spaces and actually be the resistant fighters that, you know, we all inherently have and are. Like, there's so much policing that goes on within galleries, within the artist creation, within, you know, you might even be writing a piece and in the work that I write, and you send that off to an editor, and that editor happens to be white. And that editor suddenly wants to correct everything that you've said. And it's almost like, well, not almost, it's a contemporary assimilationist approach for our creativity. And you know, I think there's a duty that, you know, the arts have in making sure we're continually keeping up with the First Nations space, with allowing us to be able to share what needs to be shared, and the truth for that matter, and not policing the creativity that does exist within you know, our First Nations space. Everyone wants the First Nations person to be part of the idea, to push forward, to put it out there, but there's always that whiteness that is centralized in the process that tries to take control of that art. And if we look at the history of art, it's resistance, and it's actually a space where we can tell stories in different narratives. We can tell stories in our vision dialogue, or we can tell it in our oral teachings. We can write it down. And I think, you know, there's a duty that as actual structural spaces, it's time to start creating priority positions, priority nights for First Nations people. And that might be, you know, when you have things like the Archibald, well, have our elders seen the incredible art that's here? Have our elders seen, since it's, you know, it's been over 90 years since First Nations person has won the Archibald, where's the Elders Night happening? Where are we inviting our community to come and acknowledge this space so we can say, you know what, we're here because of you, and we're honouring you, and we're sharing this space with you. And I think there's a duty that structures have, and I think there's a duty that when we're looking at, you know, the positions, the employment, we're not just the program manager, we're not just the front line, we're the directors, we're the CEOs of our own space, and we're the IP of our own work. And it's time, we're in 2020, and that's what's needed, I think, in this space.
One of the catchphrases I've heard is, what's your succession plan? Like, how are you installing First Nations people so that they can inherit the next positions? Blak Douglas, do you agree that the gatekeepers tend to be white people?
Yeah.
I was halfway through asking that, and I was like, what am I even saying that for? Yeah, okay, so...
And the security guard people on the gates are white people.
Yeah, okay.
Kicking the black people out.
And are First Nations people police in your experience in gallery spaces?
That's another loaded question.
Yeah.
I think we can always improve on things, and there is improvement to be made across the board on how of how First Nations art is accessed and exhibited, and so I'm just really happy to be able to be part of perhaps a momentum that is working towards that improvement.
I like the idea of the momentum, but yeah, it does sound like that's not, we've got to hold tight. You've got to keep being patient, doesn't it? That's the implication. Tell me about mainstream Australia's perception of Aboriginal art.
Yeah, we were discussing this earlier, weren't we? How, if for those people who are watching right now, if you want to run a little test on this one, you just Google Aboriginal art. So you just simply Google Aboriginal art.
That's what comes up.
And we get a consistency of representation of a dot style painting, and that's something that, as a contemporary artist, myself and my colleagues have been battling for about 40 years now, or at least it seems to be so concreted into people's minds that there's a generic type of art, to the fact where if a non-Indigenous teacher in a primary school is assigned the responsibility of teaching art, Aboriginal art, to the kids, and they don't know a thing about Aboriginal art, you can download a Department of Education PDF that will teach you about emu tracks in the sand and U-shaped figures sitting on the ground. And that's a consistently generic thing. And then somebody like me goes into a school to do a workshop and shows them images of artists like Richard Bell, Ken Tyde, Christian Thompson, Carla Dickens, Destiny Deacon, and it's just, people are just gobsmacked and are hit with a wall. Well, that doesn't look like Aboriginal art.
Right.
We've got some images up on screen there. You know, Destiny Deacon was such an inspiration when we were studying art or learning about Aboriginal art. The first, arguably the first artists to use found objects and these little dolls in these incredibly morbid narratives. And once again, it's just often so shocking that your psyche says this can't be Aboriginal art. Yes, it's an Aboriginal doll, but can't we look at something more passive, like a bunch of people sitting on the ground in the desert?
So it comes back to that question of authenticity. And is that something that you come up against as well, Vanessa, this idea of authenticity?
In what type of space?
I guess in your indigeneity.
I think, you know, for me personally, you know, growing up with, you know, my proud Bunjalung father and you know, my beautiful Irish mother, you know, there's definitely stereotypes that people care about. Well, what's the authentic Black and what's the authentic person that represents Blackness? You know, but, you know, one of the things that I'll always say to that is we need to understand like the history of this country, and we need to understand the way that it has shaped where we are today, and very much this idea of what is authentic. I think if that yarn is coming from a white person, we'll just turn away, because you do not have to have that conversation with a white person as a Black person in this space. But I think if it's coming from your own community, and if it's coming from your own space or your own mob, there's definitely something to say about accountability and being able to kind of speak to each other and create those safe spaces to have those yarns. Yeah, that's probably what I'd say, if that answers your question.
So Art After Hours is a regular Wednesday thing. It used to be live in the gallery and there were lots of people. It was a really good night out. Having done quite a few, I would say that there's a lot of people in those spaces that look like me, which is to say colonisers. And I imagine that that's who's watching tonight. So to those people, the question I want to ask and have you answer is, how can we continue the energy of Black Lives Matter when it's not trending, when it's just a regular week? How can allies show up for you?
Do you want to yarn first?
No, go on.
Oh. You know, that question comes all the time. You know, and I think it's actually about genuinely showing up. And, you know, it is a cheesy line, but showing up can mean anything in your space. You know, if you're someone who works in a corporate space, you know, I'm a paralegal with Gilbert and Tobin Law Firm. And one of the things our managing partner is committed to is making sure we are giving back to our First Nations people with our pro bono team, with our different lawyers that we have. That's one form of showing up. That's another. There's a photo right there. Start paying the rent. Start looking at the country that you're on. How are you supporting that community? How are you supporting local elders? How are you supporting children? How are you demanding your advocacy that says, you know what, we need to start making sure we're addressing this issue of this disproportionate impact of Aboriginal kids in out-of-home care? How are we looking at the incarceration rates? How are we understanding the law of the land that we're on at the moment? It might be speaking to a community, it's calling your local minister, it's demanding that when we do have things like a death in custody happen, that you are at the front of that police station, that you are demanding, you know what, the DPP needs to stop investigating the police force. You need to start kind of getting a bit more strategic in your thinking about addressing the systemic structures that are targeting us. And it is a very much, you know, we all have different roles in our communities as First Nations people, but we get tired. Yeah. We do get tired. We are human. And if you're serious about justice, and if you're serious about being on the right side of humanity, and you're serious about being on the right side of love, if you're a non-Indigenous person out there, well, come and stand with us, because you are welcome in this space. You are welcome to use your voice, and you are welcome to be an ally within us fighting for this, because we are not going to get there without coming together. And if we haven't seen right now with what's happening in the States prove that, I think Australia needs another wake-up call.
Blak Douglas?
Ditto. The beautiful thing that's happening here is that Vanessa speaks like a Richard Bell painting, you know, like there's all this loaded stuff happening in that painting. So, yeah, look, I can't say much more than that, but to simply but compliment. But the thing is, if people feel physically uncomfortable about turning up to the protests that are happening, which I always wonder why the numbers aren't exponentially increased. We're seeing a greater increase with the marches that have been taking place, and that's a tremendous thing. But please join the online protests. Every time Black youth is slain by the corrective services or the police, there is an online protest. And you can be represented by being there and signing up for those petitions. And just ask yourself, like, how would you feel if it was your kid? Yeah. That's simply the matter. And we're now up to what abhorrent statistic? We're still up in the the most incarcerated race on the planet. And so this is 2020, like we said earlier. It's about time it stopped.
Blak Douglas, do you have any advice for young Indigenous artists?
Yeah, don't tag the wall, paint on the canvas. If you need a canvas, I'll buy it for you. Don't get caught by the gungies, because there's too many of you mobbing inside already, you know?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm always telling the young fellas. As I've done, for a start, I had to deal with my dad, who was a mean-looking black fella, and I didn't want to get in trouble, so I decided to start making stuff on canvas. And then the excitement of ultimately one day being an institution like this, you can exhibit that message and get into an art award, and then the general public sees and our message is further promoted.
Vanessa, it's November 11. If you're watching this live, January 26 is not that far away. How can allies, how can non-Indigenous people mark that day to be the best allies we can be?
I think, you know, Blak said it perfectly. If you can't physically show up, because, you know, we have, on January 26th, we have our Invasion Day protest, which is boycotting the streets, and it's pretty much demanding justice for our land, our cultural birthrights, our kids in out-of-home care, juvenile justice, adult ward systems, abolition, you know, name the many injustices. But like Blak said, you know, it's getting on social media, it's showing the conversation if you physically can't turn up. And I think also to be the best ally, it's about having those uncomfortable conversations with those people. And, you know, one of the common things that I've seen in the past with a lot of non-Indigenous people is that fear to kind of confront even their own family members. Well, it is November the 11th, it's 2020. Start having those serious conversations with your family members. Start actually reflecting. When we look at this day and we look at what it means and what it symbolises for my people, for Blacks people, and what it means for this country, it's not something to be proud of. Australia's nationalism is not something to ever be proud of in this country. It's something that's built on genocide, and it's something that, you know, if you actually have something inside your spirit that says, I want to fly the Australian flag, and I want to represent the Southern Cross on my arms, and I want to sing the national anthem when it's playing, well, you're singing a song that represents the justification and the process of killing our people and harming First Nations people. So if you want to be the best ally and you want to show up, start standing with us, start following our spaces, come to the protest, demand that justice like we've been speaking about all tonight, and have those uncomfortable yarns. Have those yarns. If you see it in your dinner table, confront it. If you see you know, a sibling kind of be like, I don't know what to do, pull them up. You know, a lot of love can go a long way. And if you're demanding that justice and you're demanding that healthy conversation, you're demanding love, because that's all we want. We want a space of love. We want a space of community, and we welcome our Indigenous people here in this space.
Thank you so much. One of the things I'm really going to take from this conversation is to show up to protests. That is a really key message that I'm getting from both of you. Sometimes it feels like we're a passenger or a guest, or I guess not the main event in turning up to a protest, and that's perfectly okay. Yeah. So
that's literally like, there's a saying, you know, you're a guest on this country, act accordingly. To all non-Indigenous people in this space, you are a guest, but you're welcome to our homes and you're welcome to our lands to actually start having these conversations. And that's a legitimate fear that non-Indigenous people, I feel, have. Shit, where do I belong? Where am I meant to be? Do I have a place to be there? Am I woke enough? Am I cool enough? Well, you know what? That week's finished for the Black Lives Matter trending. Well, come actually really trend with us now, and come actually really walk with us in this space.
I love that. I feel like having a cry now.
Can I quickly throw one in?
Please.
And come into the art gallery and see the Archibald and see Dujuan, because Dujuan is now a two-dimensional monument hanging within the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and just share your empathy with that boy, and just ask yourselves why a 12-year-old Aboriginal boy from the desert had to go to the UN to ask to plead the UN to intervene because Australia is not looking after his people.
Dujuan Hoosan there is the subject of Blak Douglas's Archibald finalist portrait there, and he's also the subject of the film In My Blood It Runs, which you can watch for free on ABC iView. Do it right now. It's an amazing film, isn't it? A real insight. Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you. It's been really amazing. I was so stressed I was going to stuff it up. So watch the film. Also, Blak Douglas's solo show Corroboration Nation launches on 26th of November at Nanda Hobbs in Chippendale in Sydney. You have a chance to go there and see it once it opens. Follow Vanessa Turnbull-Roberts on Instagram to find, and Twitter for that matter, to find out where she's going to be if she happens to be leading any protests. The gallery is open 10 to 5 p.m. daily. If you want to see these artworks, you don't need a ticket or pre-booking to see the general collection, but you do need to book to see the Archibald Wynne and Sulman prizes. The gallery's website has all the details. Art After Hours Online is supported by Macquarie University and the Art Gallery Society of New South Wales. Next week, we're going to hear from artist Marlene Rabuncha in conversation with the gallery's curator of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, Kobe Edgar, about Marlene's stunning soft sculptures on display as part of the new exhibition, which is called Joy. My name's Yumi Stynes. Thank you so much for joining us today.